and welcome. This is Lisa Jones, and you are listening to the Exploring Death podcast. Hello and welcome to the Exploring Death podcast. I'm Lisa Jones, your host, and today I have with me Becky Aud-Jennison. She has identified herself as a death talker, a therapist gone rogue. A fire was lit in Becky to create the Death Dialogues Project after intimately walking her brother and mother home in 2017. An expansive thinker, even as a child, it was her dad's visits after his death that validated that. Indeed, energy does not die. A believer that our stories are the greatest teachers about all things death. Her mission is to help bring conversations surrounding death, dying, and the aftermath out of the closet. Welcome, Becky.
Hi, I'm so glad to be with you today.
Oh my gosh, I am so glad to have you here. I feel like we are such kindred spirits and that we both have this real desire to talk about death and bring it out of the closet and really help people embrace it to help them live more fully. So tell me about these visits from your father. How old were you when your father died?
Well, I was 22 when my father died, and I think for just a little background story, it's kind of interesting. So he wasn't a settled man. He wasn't a great father. He had obviously had a very abusive childhood himself with a lot of abandonment. And so as a child, I was the youngest of four, with a 15-year-old span between me and my oldest brother. And then I had three older brothers. And the youngest brother, my brother Max, was 7 years older than me. So one of the things that I enjoyed doing was tagging along with my father. My father was one of these people that had just this wonderful, charismatic, hopeful, funny sense of humor with everybody else. But in our home life, was a rageaholic and, could get violent. And so I realized with time, as we do, that was a really safe place for me, was to follow him along on these journeys outside of the house. And one thing that he was really adamant about doing was visiting people in the hospitals. So I was at many a deathbed, and then going to the visitations in the States, as it is, with visiting before the funeral, and sometimes the funerals, many times with people I didn't know at all. And so this was a foundation. And, this was just really some recent exploration as I've been talking with other people, thinking, yeah, that was embedded in me deeply even then. And so with my father had a brain aneurysm. And right when I started nursing school in 1981, in 1980, it had leaked some. And so we knew it was coming. He was aphasic. It was really bad then, but if the blood absorbed, he could be okay. If he decided to do an operation, it was handling so much brain tissue that it could be great risk. So he decided not to. We thought he became very sweet during that time. And there was a period of time, I was out of the house by then. I would check in with my mom. So his dad, still not raging. And it didn't take much time at all for him to fall back in that pattern. But he was very aware of his death, impending death, and would talk about it openly. And they told him, when it hits the next time, it will be sudden. And it was. And my mother regrets she called an ambulance, but she did. And they took him to the hospital and virtually discovered that he was brain dead. So we had that ritual of our family being around him and the staff in a neuro ICU in St. Louis, Missouri, and having to witness him coming off the life support. And, it's just an interesting dynamic for me then. By then I was a nurse, and so I was in the medical realm, but also just watching how my family morphed into the fear of this man to the compassion, I think is the best word for it. And so, everybody was deeply moved, but, again, as we know, as life goes on, lots of processing is happening then with your childhoods, et cetera. So I say all that to preface that I think my dad actually, as much as he could, there was love there, right? So the first thing that happened was we spent that night with my oldest brother, who lived not far away. My dad died about 4 p.m. And then my mother and one of my other brothers, the second oldest, and myself, we went and we stayed at their house the following night. And I actually have this recorded on my podcast as an episode. I think it's called Ghost Story, if anybody wants to listen to it there. But basically what happened was I slept with my mom. I didn't want to go into, the bed was all in disarray from where the ambulance had come and picked my father up. And it just didn't set I'll be with mom. And then my brother was in the back bedroom. And about 5 a.m., my mom and I both wake up. We hear this noise, this tink, tink, tink noise. And my brother comes running in and he has this music box in his hand. Okay. So if we look at this, let me just unpack it a little bit. So my dad used to always get up bright and early, 5 a.m. My dad was an incessant shopper of the blue light special at Kmart. And at one point had brought me back home this music box that never worked. And it didn't have the little ballerina in it. It was just quite like, kind of symbolized my childhood in some ways. Like, oh, it looks good, but there's really not anything going on inside. And the one thing that we all found pretty irritating is, especially on Sunday mornings before church, he would go banging the doors, singing at the top of his lungs, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" from Oklahoma, right?
Wow.
From that musical. We happened to be from Oklahoma. We were in Illinois at the time. And the thing that we didn't like about that is the line, "I've got a wonderful feet, everything's going my way," because that's kind of the way it went. And so my brother comes in here, tink, 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 and it's 5 a.m. at the time my father would have usually gotten up. We have a music box that's never worked. It's closed. And guess what song it's playing? "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." My brother's dancing and make it stop, make it stop. I mean, older brother, this is no child. And my mom, we just all look at each other and we just said, it's dad. It has to be dad letting us know whatever, he's there. And yet the day before when I got home, just the curious person I've always been and the lover of people's stories and connection, I had dove into his drawers and, there's his pants hanging up with the change and his keys still in his pocket. So I had this big shift in my mind, although I'd always been an open thinker about it, but it was just this conclusive thought that energy does not die. He was not here 1 minute, and this expansive form of personality and love or whatever, compassion, and then gone the next moment. I just knew that in my heart. And then I felt like that was so validating of that. So what happened was my mom told my brother, "Go put it in dad's room." And he went and put it on his dresser and it turned off then.
Oh my gosh, what a story. That's amazing.
Yeah, so that was, thank you. It was, it felt amazing to us. And my mom and dad were very fundamentalist Christian people. So, it's not like this was their second language, although my mom had always been pretty open. And then beyond that, there was, and I wasn't fluent in how visitations might happen or anything like that, but I had a dream one night that I was living where I was in a trailer and I was in my bed and there was a knock on my trailer door. And I go and I open the trailer and there's my dad in his typical gardening garb. And he doesn't say a word. He looks gentle and he walks in and he holds me and I can feel it. And there was this communication on a nonverbal level. And I just knew that was, "I'm sorry, I love you," a overwhelming sense of that. And woke up immediately saying, I felt that. Telling myself I felt that felt so real. So those are the first two things. And then, part of the reason my project was born, although I've always been a champion professionally trying to increase conversations surrounding death and dying. And I've worked a lot with people whose lives were dwindling and really tried to get health professionals to kind of look at having more conversations and less denial around death. So that's always been a part of me. But after my mother and my brother died in 2017, and they were really kind of my soul pillar people, the people that had knew me, knew everything about me, were always there for me. And then I just have a whole list of little hellos from them since they've been gone too. So
Wow.
I do say, and I know I've talked to a couple mediums who validate that it doesn't matter how much of a believer or how much you know that happens, you still miss the person's physical form when they go. And then there can be a little doubter in me, to the point where I've said to a few people, you know, I think until my brother comes and sits down and has a cup of coffee with me, I don't know if I'll be 100%, you know, satisfied. But I really am working at that, Lisa, to, you know, enhance that connection and that openness and turn the thinking brain off and connect in a love space.
I love that. I really appreciate you saying that, because I too find that I'm my own biggest skeptic at times about things happening, and yet it logically doesn't make sense what's happening. And yet my brain wants to make it all logically, you know, fit together. And, you know, like you said, like, yeah, if my husband is really talking to me, I want him to come and so I can see him and, you know, have this experience, rather than just kind of these etheric connections and, you know, and kind of coincidental situations that happen. And yet that does give me such great solace to feel like, wow, that did happen, you know. And also what you said about missing the person, because even though I can connect, or you connect with your loved ones, we still miss them deeply. When my mother died now almost 6 years ago, she was truly she was my person, that she believed in me 100%. I mean, talk about unconditional love. I mean, it was probably the closest thing I've ever felt on this earth to unconditional love. And when she died, it just really, it took me out even, I mean, definitely even more so than when my husband died. And, you know, so it's grief is real. I mean, I don't want to negate the fact that just because we know that we don't die, that it's still very real.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think it's interesting, your point about, you know, your mother even being, you know, having a stronger grief connection. And I think that was the bit that for me, it's like, yeah, these were our life partners, literally, you know. And sometimes we don't think about that. You know, we think, oh, of course the romantic life partner will be the one that would be the biggest loss. But, you know, these people they take our stories with them. They take memories with them. That, you know, that's what I'm finding and seeing is like, yeah, really, nobody else will ever know my full story like they did. And yeah, and that's just our restructuring that happens with loss. You know, we become different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because after both my mom and dad died and my husband, you know, it was like, suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like an orphan, you know. And it's funny to take these words that, I mean, orphan is typically a child that loses their parents, but it does feel a little that way when you're left with really nobody that has those life stories, you know, in your life. I mean, I have a dear brother and thank God he's still here, but I can't even imagine once he's gone, like, oh my gosh, I'm really all alone. So
yeah.
It's
it's good that you have a little, you know, that's part of the sharing of stories that's so important. There's no way you can explain these things. There's no way you can hear one story, read one book, read one chapter on something and really, really get it. It's by your experience. You know a little bit about, okay, if my brother goes before me, I have a little sense of what this is going to do. But before these other things happened, before your other losses, that might not have even made sense to you so much.
Right. That's so interesting. So I'm curious too. So talk a little bit about losing your mom and your brother. Like what are some of the stories that come to mind that you'd like to share?
So with my brother and I were super close. He was like the good father figure, progressive thinker, like everything good about being a human I learned from him, compassion. And then we morphed into best friends as young adults. And I was younger than him, obviously, but he kind of plucked me out of a really difficult situation that my parents had plugged me into right after high school graduation. It was just like, you're coming with me, you are going to go to college. My parents had just yanked university right out from under me, and I was left down in Texas in a situation that wasn't very stable. When my kids got that age, it's like, oh my goodness, you know, one of those revelations, like, how could they have done that? But he saw that, and at some point was just like, this is enough of this. And so we had been close. He had been more as a mentor and a teacher as a child, but then we became processors together. We processed our childhood. I think one of the biggest gifts he gave me, he was a deep feeler and a beautiful speaker and communicator. And in fact, spoke at many a funeral himself and was asked to give talks a lot. And he just had a way with words, but he was full of compassion. And so he had thankfully gotten over here to spend some time with me in New Zealand. And we had a beautiful kind of like full circle as adults coming back around, both of our lives going very well. Our families were doing well. Our spouses, you know, he would just say, how lucky did we get with our background that we've got the spouses we do, you know, gentle souls, kind souls. And then when he got back 6 months later, he calls me. We did a lot of talking on the phone, and I'm talking like 2-hour phone calls. And he calls me January 2nd in 2016 saying, Beck, I just need to process it with you. I'm getting a little concerned. I forgot my password to my computer. And he and his wife had moved up to Michigan, where her family was not that long before that. And, you know, I kind of did my little mini assessment as we're talking, mini mental assessment. And at that point, right then, that was primarily the main thing. So I kind of gave him the feedback that, you know, look at everything you've been through and you've switched offices and places to live. Well, long story short, 6 months later, there was a conclusive diagnosis of primary CMS lymphoma, which is a form of brain cancer. The 6 months prior to that, he was being treated for encephalitis, a form of autoimmune encephalitis. But that was the last lucid phone call I had with him, was on that January 2nd. And we had beautiful, beautiful connect time. I went and stayed and took care of him, you know, or helped to take care of him a lot of the time. And I was with him when he did cross over, and had been with him the month before that, just to have some more time in. So that was a very meaningful time for me, because I knew, just because I knew him like I did. And the same with my mom. My mom had preached, you know, more natural death stories to us. She was not a fan of the funeral industry and what it had turned into. And so we ended up, taking care of him at home during that last week of life is when I got there, and then keeping him home for 3 days for vigil. And we contacted a funeral home. I'd asked the social worker. Hospice had just gotten on board. Once he took that final turn, it went very, very quickly, and had asked her, give me the name of a place that you think would be more open, because, and, you know, we just made this connection. We both are aware of Zenith Drago's work. I had just seen her movie, or the documentary based on her, Zen and the Art of Dying. And that really empowered me to watch that just a couple of weeks before his death. And so I told his wife before I got there, I said, just know if something happens before I get there, that you don't have to rush to call anybody. You know, take that time. That can be some of the most important time. And in a way, I guess that planted a little seed with her, because then she was just very open to letting the process flow. And we lucked out getting a funeral director saying, I know this trend is coming. We've never had it happen before. But if you don't want to embalm, these are steps to take while you have him home, and you can have him home as long as you want. He said, we will come at the drop of a hat. We will be there within an hour when you call. And just couldn't have been kinder, couldn't have had a better response. And we just had the most beautiful family vigil, family time. I told her, you know, this right here, this is worth 3 years of therapy right here, with his younger kids, kind of high schoolers and a bit of a quieter disposition. And I would hear his wife, Barb, walk up to them and say, are you ready for Dad to go yet? Nope. And so we had him until the funeral was going to be the next day. And at that time, with everything, the singing, the story sharing, you know, people in the next room doing food and looking through pictures and writing notes and putting them in his pockets, and, you know, everything imaginable. We had a beautiful music always going, but we have musicians in the family and a friend musician that came and played. And I mean, we were wrenched, obviously, but there could be agonizing tears and then, you know, laughter commingling, and we could hold his hand and touch his body, and it felt real, you know. And I had taken care of people in my nursing career, so I was comfortable with taking care of his body afterwards. And my whole family participated in that. And my oldest brother, I heard him telling the story later, because he stayed at the head of my brother, behind his head, when I said, we're not going to call hospice for a bit. We're going to take care of him first. And we'll, you know, Barb, you guys pick out some clothes and we'll bathe him and anoint him with oil. And he said, when he heard me say that, he thought, what in the heck is going on here? And then as we started the process, his wife said, I'm helping. And that's one of the most moving things to me, is that these people that was not in the realm of thinking at all. He said that's probably one of the most moving thing, or if not the most moving thing he witnessed in his life, especially when his wife came and joined in. Yes. And it was just precious. And I think what it is, Lisa, when that happens, if, you know, and not everybody can do that, obviously, not everybody can welcome that kind of space into their home or walk on that. And again, I had experience, you know, my thing was, by God, I've done this with strangers. I can do it with my own family and this person who's my soulmate that I love. But I think, you know, you just have a sense when you're in that space that, yeah, this is the way it was. This was before any industry got involved. You know, this is the human to human connection about death. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which to me is so moving. When I did the death doula program here in Maui 2 years ago, and Zenith was here, and Bodhi B, who I've interviewed on my show before, and being taught the method of being able to take care of the body and washing their hair and anointing them with oil, and, you know, keeping the ice packs and things like that to keep their body fresh. I mean, I look back at witnessing the death of my husband and both my mother and my father, and I so wish that I had had that extra time with them, and that precious, like you said, there's something, it's just the way it used to be, and it's been taken from us. And I feel like it's such a precious time to spend with a body, and to be able to say our goodbyes. And my niece in Ireland, she passed away suddenly at age 16, and they have a much more at home policy. And so she was laying in her bed, and so we could go down and spend time. And that was really my first time ever spending it, you know, with a body. And it was so precious. And I just thought how amazing that culture is so much more open. And I'd so like to see our culture here in the United States gravitate back toward that reality.
Yeah. And I think while you're saying that, what's coming to me too is that us, you know, American white folk, you know, so much of our roots they've just disseminated. You know, many of us don't really know our culture. It's really come to fore for me, you know, being here in New Zealand, where it's a relatively a much newer country, and this strong indigenous population of the Maori, and then even the Europeans that came over, you know, they pretty much know, you know, the generations and where they came from. And I feel like for me, it was a deep coming home of roots, of just in my DNA, you know, and, you know, I think about that, you know, to the wise women, some called witches in other countries and areas too, you know, that was the kind of work that we did as women. You know, that was our work, to be attending and to not be afraid of it, and to step into that liminal space, and that's where it feels like, is interestingly, as much as I'd worked with death in the past in one way or another, I remember looking at my sister-in-law at one point and saying, because I'd worked with birth a lot as well, saying, I'm feeling like a birth doula in this process. Mm-hmm. And I later I thought, well, for giggles, you know, Googled death doula, and that was 3 years ago. And, you know, it was really starting and there's been a bigger wave, you know, that's just been gathering since then. So it's like, yep, that makes sense. And, you know, I mean, I know this isn't my area of saying I figured this out. I mean, you hear for people that really, really, really are present with death, it's always compared to birth if they've been present to birth in the past as well. Those
Yes,
thresholds.
yes, absolutely. And even for me, my out of body experience when my husband died and I left my body and went to another realm, which I call heaven because it looked very much like what I had been told heaven would look like. And the welcome party that he received, it was much, he didn't come through you know, a vaginal canal coming into that area. He came through a giant door that was opening and everybody just started cheering and welcoming him home. And so for me, it's so much birthing them into the next realm. And, and for me, you know, the unconditional love that they go back to and going back home and all of that. I mean, it's just one of the best experiences of my life, and certainly transformative because it completely disintegrated my entire foundation of what I was taught to believe growing up as a Lutheran. And, you know, you must be baptized to go to heaven and all that, which he wasn't. So I thought he was going to hell and, you know, all of these. I've read your book, part of your book. And I thought, oh, sister, we have a lot in common. Yeah. Yes. So
I relate to that.
So it's
well, if I can share a little bit more, because it totally relates to what you just said with my mom.
Yes, please.
So my mom lived with me here in New Zealand, and she, you know, it was so going through the process with Max and just, you know, having to keep her up to date. And there were the 6 months of not really knowing what was going on. I mean, it took a toll on her, a visual toll on her. And she was in her 90s. She was 95 when she died. And after Max's death in January of 2017, and she would talk openly about it. We were very, very open. And she would talk about, you know, she'd always said, you know, as most parents do, a child should never go before a parent. But then, you know, she just kind of mindfully started dwindling, and I would record stories and she would tell me stories, and you better ask me now about these things. And I mean, there was a sense of almost a little badge of honor that she was extremely coherent and well equipped for her age. And so, you know, there was almost this, I'm taking you on this journey with me, enjoy it kind of feeling. And so she started, she had to get blood once a month. And after a while, her levels weren't going down so low, but she was continuing to diminish as far as weakness and appetite. And actually, you know, if you look textbook, what are signs of the death process? You know, she started that about 3 or 4 months out. And we have an ashram up north that has some beautiful offerings. And I was going to go to a few-day silent retreat, and had canceled one time because she had a bad cold. And you just didn't know at that age, right? Like, is this, you know, could this lead into something? And so it was coming back around in October, and I knew she was diminishing. I ran it by my sister-in-law and my daughter, you know, should I go? Everybody's saying to go. My husband's saying to go. Mom's saying to go. And they're like, yeah, go. She looks great. You know, she looks fine. We were just talking to her. So I went and I stocked up at one of those places that carries all kind of medical supplies. And the woman I talked to, I told her what I was doing just in case my husband needed it for those few days I was away. So we had gotten a commode already, but, you know, maybe some bed mats and those kind of things. And I told her what was happening. And she said, I just assisted my best friend crossing over. And she said, you talk to her team every day, throw out and tell her team, please take care of her. Please guide her over gently. So I did listen to them. You know, Mom really, really wanted me to go. And I took off and I went to this thing up in the sticks, no internet. You know, my husband had a number to call, and he was to call me if she took a dramatic turn, and didn't get a phone call in between, but I call him on the way back. And he does tell me, yeah, you know, there's a difference. You're going to see a difference. Well, every night I would go out and the stars here are just magnificent. And I would say, Max, please gather the team, please. It was actually breaking my heart. You know, I did not want to see my sweet little mother suffer. She had suffered during her life. She was a depression baby who's picked cottons till her hands bled when she was 3 years old. And then she'd gone into this marriage that, you know, she's very vocal about it at this age. Like, I hope I don't run into him in heaven. I mean, that vocal about it. Excuse me. And so I just wanted there to be grace. And honestly, I just didn't want selfishly to see her suffer, to have my heart just pulled out and, you know, please let this be a gentle process. And that I just put out there every night. And and along these ways, I'm having little signs from Max. You know, we could do a whole series or a whole episode just on my little signs from both of them. But I'm having little signs from Max that, okay, you know, he's tuned in anyway. So I get home and I kid you not, I go into her room and she's sitting on the edge of the bed and I'm like, Mom, you look good. Look at you. You're up, you're sitting here. And she looks up at me and she said, I'm not going to have another night like I had last night. She was Methodist. Before that is Child Baptist, very fundamentalist, but had broadened her horizon through lots of conversation and Oprah Winfrey, thank you very much, you know, all sorts of things. She had, you know, she was broadened. She wasn't so rigid about it has to go a certain way. And she said, Becky, I had a dream last night that I was in hell and I can't have another night like that. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I wasn't burning in hell, but it was like I was having a tour of hell. And she said, it was horrible. It was hellacious. I cannot have that. I can't go through that again. And I said, well, Mom, you know, calling on my old school, you know, Mom, that just had to be God showing you what you're not going to experience. And, you know, there was a visceral exhale. So she said, it's happening now. I'm going to die now. And I said, okay. And she starts going into the speech, saying all of her goodbyes to different people, like naming names. And I said, Mom, do you want me to pause? And again, you know, she's weary. This isn't a woman that's sitting up at her bedside saying, I'm ready to die now. You know, she's weary. And so I actually have a 7-minute video of her going through names and telling them how much she loves them and that their love means everything to her. That's what she lived for, apologizing for what she put her children through, and ending, it's the most precious, ending with 3 kisses and a bye-bye. So I was able to send that to my kin, next of kin, and say, this is, you know, we've done a few practice runs. This appears to be the real one. And within 24 hours, she had died.
Wow.
But the moment of death. So we talked about it. She was seeing her mother and calling out Mama. We talked about that. She said, I wonder if somebody's going to come help me. And she'd never said the words before with her Christian upbringing, crossover. The whole entire death process, her words were about that, crossover and other side, which I'd never heard her use those terms before. Well, I had gone to a death cafe and a man that was there said, you know, the Tibetan Buddhist monks say when the spirit's leaving the body is when the tongue goes to the roof of the mouth, which I had never heard before and I had never witnessed it during a death time. And it's like, okay. And I might have mentioned that to Mom. I know I mentioned it to my husband, and I'm sure I did with her because, again, we talked all things death. So probably for the last 6 hours of those 24 hours, she wasn't coherent anymore. And I would crawl up in bed with, you know, I was just doing all the comfort, you know, stroking and, you know, washcloth, a cool washcloth, and talking to her and music. And her minister person here had come and sang to her and read some scripture. And so this wasn't anything that could have remotely been, well, I don't think could have been considered conscious at that time, although I'm very sure she was probably hearing a lot of what was going on. So I see a little bit of a shift in her. And since I'm just not leaving her bedside at all during this period, I just said to my husband, just get the blood pressure cuff, just out of curiosity. And so I can't get her blood pressure. And I'm like, you know, my 15-year-old then would have been 13 or 12, you know, come in. It's probably time to say goodbye to Grandma. My husband, a doctor, is going, oh, no, I don't think so. And I said, I think so. And what ended up happening, to be fair, is her death experience was a different version. I don't know quite how to explain it. Very much mimicked my brother's death trajectory. even to the point of like, really, when you're that close to death, you're still scratching your nose, you know, or they're, you know, it's like, oh, that's a Max was doing that. And so her breath changes a little bit, and my husband's in there, and she takes a big breath in, big breath out, and the biggest full face, exactly what you're describing. Like, I've walked in and there is everybody's smile, even her eyes, as if she was seeing it. I mean, that is so comforting to me. It just came over her whole face, her whole being. I mean, I wanted to take a picture to show my relatives, but it's like, okay, I've just got to be in this moment. My husband calls my son in. He sees her like that. And then, you know, as those breaths can be very, very far apart at the very end, we think that's it. She takes another big, deep breath in, and her chin juts out and her tongue goes up to the roof of her mouth. It was startling looking. But I went back to that whole, the Tibetan Buddhist monks say, when that happens is when their spirit's released. Big exhale, and that was it. That was the final breath. Oh, wow. So that, I don't know if I can communicate it as magical as that was for me. That just was just so.
I love what you just said about magical, because I think for me, all three of the deaths that I've attended have been magical. And I think that to me is one of the biggest secrets that people don't realize about death. I mean, there's so much fear wrapped around it that they miss out how magical the experience can be. Again, I understand that's not always the way it is.
Right.
But I think if you've done the work and you're open to the experience, it can be very magical.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think your point is very, very important, because we can get wrapped up in the magic of these things. You know, my brother's wasn't, you know, the experience afterwards was magical, but he, you know, was in a different space because he, you know, wasn't talking to me right up to the end and that type of thing. So it was a different experience. Yeah, but we know, you know, be it a long extended dying period or be it something that happens very quickly and is a, you know, horrible tragedy, you know, we can't predict what's going to happen. And again, that's where I'm a believer that just these stories can expand us and help us be a little bit more prepared when that time comes, in whatever fashion it comes.
I love it. Well, I would love to pull a few cards on that note.
Sure.
And see what Spirit has to share with us. And just one quick thing. I loved what you said about your mom with the video and waving and kissing, you know, the 3 kisses and waves. I was recently attending it was a satsang for Ram Dass, but this was on December 2nd.
Oh,
and
you were there.
I was there, and they actually wheeled him out because he was alive still on December 2nd, and they wheeled him out. He looked very, you know, nearing the end. He was kind of hunched over, his head was down, but then right at the very end, as they started backing him off, he lifted his head with a big smile, and he gave like a little air kiss with his hand and then a wave goodbye. And I felt like all 900 people that were staring at him all thought, wow, that's his final goodbye. And then sure enough, 20 days later is when he actually did take his final exit. But it was just so startling to see him so hunched over and kind of internal, and then to have this big bright smile and waves and kisses. So
oh, thank you so much for sharing that. He's been a real important figure for me, and with his work surrounding death and his beautiful book. And I had an amazing dream about him that night. And I'm not one that can conjure dreams, you know, like, please come to me in a dream, and it happened, but it did. And it was just like, wow. It was almost like a lucid dreaming, because it was like in the moment I knew this was just amazing. And he was in his white, and he was sitting and on the floor, not in a wheelchair. And he was not maybe as old as he is now. And he was holding beads. And it was a very heavenly feel to it, a very esoteric feel to it. And not as if I was the only person there. And it was just like, a big exhale. And, you know, like, yeah, just a beautiful, beautiful feeling. He's just affected so many people. I was listening to his to him this morning, actually.
Oh, beautiful. Wow. Thank you for sharing that about that experience with him. So many people have had that. And I just love hearing, you know, the connection and how much love that he's just spreading to so many people all around the world.
Yes.
So let's see so this is a reading. So the first card is enthusiasm, and it's actually the blockage card. And I feel like for both you and I, most people don't have so much enthusiasm around death as you and I do.
Yeah.
People are like, death, oh my gosh, run, don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And but I love that you and I are, you know, this is our life path, it's our life work. I mean, I can't not do this. This is literally just, you know, I feel so compelled, as I think you do as well.
Yes, definitely.
And the action card is beginnings. And I think, again, what I'm getting from this is we're beginning to see a shift and this opening and this embracing of the way it used to be. You know, it's coming full circle. And the more that we can get these stories out to people and to embrace what the experience is, you know, the more, you know, just the more people will be able to have a good death and be able to, like you said, skip 3 years of therapy
really
by being able to really fully embrace it and talk about it in the time. And that's the outcome, is then radiance, is that, you know, people are able, not only the people that experience the death of their loved one, but also their loved one can go on and be in this radiant place and share their joy and not have people question that, you know, is that a sign? Is that a sign? Yes, it's a sign.
Yeah. Yeah, that I think it's interesting, you know, as soon as you said radiance, I think not just because it sounds similar, but the Ram Dass experience and everything about him, right? It's just exudes radiance. I would like to, you know, your readers, his beautiful book, Walking Each Other Home, I'd highly recommend that. It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, wonderful. I've so enjoyed chatting with you. So how can people find you?
So probably the quickest way is just to go to our website. And I say our, meaning me and all of the storytellers who share their stories. I just feel like it's a collective. I'm sure you feel much the same way. It's just filled with energy of all of these beautiful, beautiful stories. And that's at www.deathdialogues.net. And there you can find some writing, and you can find the podcast platforms and information about the podcast. The most recent episode is always in there under the podcast link. And and find your way to our Instagram page, Death Dialogues project, and Facebook page. And that's how people get in touch with me. Yeah.
Fantastic. And of course, I will have all those links also on my website so people can easily find you there. But thank you so much, Becky. It's such a joy. And I just love all your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Exploring Death podcast. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Before you make any financial or legal decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Exploring Death. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.